This is a production of Cornell University.
So this is a story about nitrogen management on maize, corn, and basically research, development of a tool, extension of that tool, and then recently the commercialization of that tool. So a little bit of background about nitrogen, especially on corn. And there's kind of two components of it. Of course, the production, the agronomic aspect, and then the environmental component. So farmers spend a lot of money on nitrogen. Sometimes they spend more on nitrogen than they do on seed. End use efficiency remains quite low. A lot of that nitrogen gets lost, doesn't end up in the plant. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with nitrogen management, especially with increasing weather variability. And then we have all these what we call negative externalities. So high energy input because of the Haber-Bosch process to manufacture synthetic nitrogen. The greenhouse gas emissions, very considerable. I'll show you some data on that. And then persistent water quality problems, basically. And we've been throwing a lot of money at that for years without really any progress. So a little bit about the hypoxia problem. I'm sure you're familiar with it. So we have this dead zone basically in the Gulf of Mexico that develops in the late summer every year. And the EPA has some goals to get that down to about 2,000 square miles, but we're persistently averaging about 5,000 even this year. So we're not really making any progress. This is where most of it comes from. Obviously, corn production areas, especially on poorly drained soils that have tile drainage, that causes a hydrologic shortcut. And so the EPA has, through the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan, a goal to reduce those losses by 45%. Even if you get 100% of the farmers to really manage their nitrogen very carefully, it will be very difficult to reach 45%. You're never going to be able to get 100% of the farmers. So it's challenging. The EPA is pushing it onto the states, and they each have their own goals. And I should mention, of course, that Chesapeake Bay, very similar problem. And so this is not an easy problem to address. In addition, we have the greenhouse gas emissions. So nitrous oxide is the largest contribution from agriculture in terms of global warming. 44%, methane is second, carbon dioxide third. Methane is probably a little higher now that they increased the GHG component. Here's a little interesting factoid. Basically, nitrogen application on agricultural land has as much of a greenhouse gas impact as the U.S. aviation industry. So all the planes that are flying around, have a similar impact. So it's a considerable problem, and we're managing it very inefficiently. So the idea is really, if we can really match the nitrogen that the plant needs exactly, so we don't over-fertilize and we just provide exactly the amount that the plant needs because it's a critical plant nutrient and it's important for yield. So what is the optimum nitrogen rate? Well, this is some data from Iowa, corn after corn, corn after soybean. So your optimum N rate may range from 100 to 250, actually probably 300. Okay, and you can say, well, most likely you're going to be needing this or this amount, but you have this huge range. Now, this is not random. There are underlying factors of this variability. Soil types, especially weather, rotations, especially, et cetera. So what AdaptN does, it aims to manage this variability, right? So that we can tell you, in this year on this field, you maybe need only about this much, but in another year, you maybe need about that much. So just improved dynamic recommendations. So a little bit about the history. So this really goes back into the 80s. A lot of people collaborated on this, even people like Jeff Wagonette and John Hudson, for those of you who have been around for a long time. So we've been able to take advantage of a lot of that investment. 1998 was really the idea that we analyzed a lot of field trials and used our model to basically replicate the results of the field trial, and we did quite well. So we were able to then say, well, we can turn that around. We can use the model to make better predictions of the seasonal nitrogen needs. And since most of that variability is the result of early season weather patterns, when you can still have an opportunity to intervene, so maybe when the corn is about this high, you have an opportunity to really improve the nitrogen recommendations. So then we got some funding, the Computational Ag Initiative. Then about 10 years, we started to send out email recommendations through the extension system. Then in 2008, we developed what's then called the AdaptN tool, and was more or less a cloud-based tool. In 2011, we started to do extensive field trials, basically in many places, many states, especially New York and Iowa. And then this past year, we licensed the product, and it's now been commercialized for a startup company. That company, by the end of the year, will have 9 employees. So, unless you've been living in a cave for the past few years, you know that cloud computing is changing the way we live, the way we shop, the way we communicate, the way we bank, everything. So, our clientele, farmers, consultants, people like that, are very mobile people. They don't sit in an office very much, so they are very much going to be benefiting from cloud-based mobile technology, and that's what we're trying to address. And then if you bring in the opportunity to do adaptive, real-time, localized services that we all, in a way, use when we use all these great apps and all that, then we can really hopefully make some progress. So now we have adaptn.com. It used to be adaptn.cals.cornell.edu. Thank God, now we have adaptn.com. It's a commercial company. You now have to pay to get an account. But it also has allowed us to really bring this up to a much higher level in terms of the sophistication, and it's growing and growing. So one of the great things about Cornell, and if you get involved with licensing and you have some equity in a company and they fund some of your research, you have to put up a slide like that. You have to disclose that you have some kind of a relationship with that company. So that's what I'm doing to you right now, just in case somebody from the committee on conflict of interest is in the room. So what does AdaptN do? And I'm not going to go into any of the details. It basically takes information on weather, soil, crop, and some economic factors to generate a nitrogen rate recommendation for a particular field at a particular time. That's basically the idea. And you can see here what all those factors are, and I'll show you some screenshots. One key component is weather. And so we're using the high-resolution weather information that's generated at the Northeast Climate Center on the 11th floor of Bradfield Hall. They've been a very critical partner in all this. And the high-resolution part of it is very critical because you can see this is a one-day precipitation graph. And you can see, for example, that this part, southeastern Iowa, received 6 to 8 inches of precipitation. But then you go only maybe about 10, 15 kilometers to the north or the east, and they only got maybe like 1 or 2 inches. Okay, so it's highly variable, and if you don't have good high-resolution weather information, you're not going to be able to make a good recommendation. In addition, we've seen that these very heavy precipitation events, defined as greater than 2 inches, have increased over the past 50 years. In general, we're seeing more of these heavy precipitation events, especially in the Northeast and certainly also in the Corn Belt. By the way, this is 1958 is the year of my birth. Correlation does not equate causation, remember? So I didn't do this, although I probably did contribute to it like all of you did. Okay, just a couple of screenshots. This is to give you a little bit of a sense of the tool. You can find your field on a map, or you can drop a shapefile, if that means anything to you. That's a GIS-based file system. Here's another one. You can see the field identified, and then you basically populate that with some information about the soil and the management. I'll show you that. For example, here's you indicate what soil type it is. It can be by name, like a honey or a silt loam, or it can just be by the textural class, like a silty clay loam or something like that. And then that links it to very extensive soil databases that we have as part of the tool. Indicate whether it's artificially drained and things like that. You provide information on the tillage methodology, how much residue is on the surface, how much organic matter is in the soil, because that's actually a very important factor. Crop information, whether it's sweet or grain or silage corn, what the maturity class is, what the date of planting, the population, the rotational effect, so what's the previous crop? Is it sod, is it soybean, is it wheat, or things like that. And then some other information, percent legume and all that, if that's appropriate. Notice also the pane here, that's a nice feature. So if you, say, manage multiple zones or multiple fields the same way, you can just click on this, and then so the same information applies to multiple fields. Those kind of things are really very important to the user. As researchers, we're like, whatever. But it's very important to the user. So then, of course, how much nitrogen you have already applied. So maybe a pre-plant application or a starter application. In the Midwest, maybe even a fall application. And then how much, when, what's the formulation? Is it anhydrous ammonia? Is it urea? Is it UAN? Whatever. How much manure has been applied, and what the content of nitrogen and all that in the manures. Of course, we're a dairy state, very important feature of this particular tool, and irrigation as well. All right, so just to give you a little bit of a sense, a little bit of flavor. So then you would run the model. Currently, it's all at a large data center, actually one in Virginia and one in Idaho, I believe. This is, these famous kind of big data centers. That's what you use. Very inexpensive, by the way. So then you get a recommendation for this particular field is 140 pounds per acre. Gives you a level of confidence, you might say, and then gives you a whole bunch of background information on how much nitrogen is currently in the soil, how much is still needed, how much has been lost so far through rainfall especially, or maybe ammonia volatilization, how much water is currently in the soil, how much precipitation have we received. There's even an irrigation advisory that will be part of that next year. And then you can enter different dates. So today's October, 16th? You're not going to be applying nitrogen on corn today, but you would be maybe on June 16th. And so you can enter June 16th or any other date, and you can then generate a recommendation for that particular date. So you can go back and at the end of the season do what-if scenarios, etc. We have some functionality that makes it attractive to a farmer. For example, it rolls up the nitrogen recommendation for each field. So this farmer would have to purchase this much nitrogen total. So, some of the functionality that helps them manage their fields. Gives the max and the min, and then it basically allows you to look at each field individually. You can just click on this, then the individual field comes up. There's nice functionalities. Then you may be an agronomist or a crop consultant who is working with multiple farmers. So they have their summaries, so these are multiple. For a typical consultant, this may be 100 or so, or even 500 fields. Okay, so try to make it attractive for them to use. So we have the daily alerts. So instead of you doing the simulation, we do it daily. So when the new weather information comes in, it gets run, and then you get an email or text message. So you basically get a daily update on the nitrogen status of your field and how much nitrogen might be needed. And you can see, this is when you bring in the professional programmers, it really, really looks nice. We also give a lot of insights. Try to be very transparent about what the recommendation is based on. So, for example, some of these graphical outputs, and I'll show you just a couple. This is precipitation and nitrogen loss. So here's the precip, and here's the nitrogen loss. Okay, so this was quite wet. So this field lost about 80 pounds of nitrogen because they had applied a lot of pre-plant nitrogen. Cumulative precipitation, leaching, and gaseous N losses. Probably by next month we'll have the N2O losses associated with that. And mineralized nitrogen and temperature, of course, they're highly correlated as well. There's more graphs that I just want to give you a sense. So now there's kind of this broader picture, and one I wanted to highlight, and that's Walmart. So Walmart has a goal to reduce their carbon footprint by, I think it's 20 million tons per year, which is really quite ambitious. Walmart did an analysis of their top 10 products. Now keep in mind that they're also the nation's largest grocer, right? They're selling a lot of groceries, and not only in the U.S., they're a global company, as you know. Revenues equivalent to the GDP of Belgium. This is a big player, largest employer in the world. So when Walmart says we want to reduce our carbon footprint, people start to pay attention. Walmart looked at the top 10 products and found that about 45% of their carbon footprint is associated with nitrogen fertilizer for the top 100 products, which is really quite remarkable. Okay, so they want to reduce that impact. So they're looking at tools like AdaptN to be able to achieve that, which we're very happy about. I was at an event last week in Bentonville, and they featured this farmer, Tim Richter. He's an Iowa farmer who's used AdaptN, and he talked about his experience with the tool, which was fortunately very positive for us. And there's organizations like EDF and TNC who are really trying to promote this. So what AdaptN now is doing is it's pushing this up the supply chain. So it has agreements from Kellogg's and General Mills and PepsiCo and Coca-Cola and Campbell Soup, Smithfield Murphy Brown, large pork producer, for them to start using these kind of tools, which is very exciting. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting close. Another interesting development was in the past year, so we've had this tool out there for a while. All of a sudden, guess what? Monsanto and DuPont Pioneer come out with an AdaptN type version. And it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. We weren't too happy. We had just licensed the product to this little startup company. And, but you know, it's actually been, I have to say, especially DuPont Pioneer is somewhat unscrupulous about these things. They pretend like they invented this. It's like, come on, you guys, you had your agronomist use our tool for 2-3 years, and we talked to your chief agronomist. You know, you didn't invent it, but at least be honest about that. But you know, there's actually been a real upside to this, because now all of a sudden everybody thinks that this approach has a lot of merit because the big guys jumped into it. And so it's actually really benefited us to see these big companies getting into this technology, because it gave a lot of credibility to what we were doing. So it's been good. So this is currently where AdaptN is being used, at least as of July. So it's a mixture of individual farms, consultants. We're even working with some larger companies that are interested in starting to use AdaptN now. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of data. So what we've done, especially in New York and Iowa, we've worked in other states as well, is do strip trials, where you basically, you go onto farmers' fields and you compare the AdaptN recommendation with what the grower normally applies. So it's a direct comparison. It's good for demonstration purposes. It gives you some good data, and it's kind of like a boxing match. There's a winner and a loser, and so you can kind of put it in those terms. And so I'll show you some of the results from New York and Iowa, and these were all the wonderful collaborators. So this is actually just we kind of summarized the data just recently. So it's 104 strip trials, so over a 3-year period. So here you see the difference in total N applied. So remember, this is the AdaptN rate versus what the grower would normally use. So in the vast majority of the cases, in 87 out of 104, the AdaptN recommendation was lower. Okay, so less nitrogen was applied, which is a good thing for the environment. In a few cases, we recommended more. And that was mostly in 2003, when we had a very wet growing season and a higher rate was justified. Okay? So this is the delta yield. So in most cases, when we said put less nitrogen on, but they were able to, on the average, achieve the same yield, that's a good thing. The same yield with less nitrogen, so less environmental impact. And then in a few cases where we said put more on, that needs to be justified by higher yields. And that was in general the case. In most cases, the yields were significantly higher when we said put a little bit more nitrogen on. So it was justified. Most of the nitrogen still ended up in the plant, which is good. And then this is the delta profit. And you can see that in the vast majority of cases, in about 4 out of 5 cases, we were able to show greater profits. So what that means is that's a win-win scenario. We can say to farmers, look, we can increase your profits on the average, and you can decrease the amount of nitrogen that you apply, so limiting the environmental impact. And basically by being more precise. So here's some of the summary data I just wanted to point out. So here you can see the end fertilizer inputs for Iowa, New York, the 3 years. So we always were able to reduce the inputs, except in 2013 in New York when it was wet, We said on the average, put a little bit more on. But on the average, we were able to significantly reduce the amount of nitrogen that goes onto the field and into the environment. The yields were, in a way, positive, primarily for the cases where we said a little bit more, and the profit on the average, about $35 per acre increase in profit. So that's positive. I'll skip the Wisconsin data. So this is basically the bottom line. So if we can do increased profits, reduced environmental inputs, and we did some model simulations to look at the leaching and nitrous oxide losses, that's a good thing. So we feel really good about that. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what's out there. And we feel that the transparency and insights, even though it's a commercial product, is really valuable still. Farmers and consultants like that. And it provides incentives for better management. We've seen a lot of farmers who are looking at the losses that they had from, say, an early season application, and then they get a lot of rain, and they lost, like in that graph, they lost 80 pounds. And so they're doing the math, and they say, boy, I lost about $50 an acre. Maybe I should change my strategy. So being transparent and informative helps with that. Okay, this is my last slide. I won't mention each of these people individually, but we've had some great collaborators. It's been a great team effort, and we're very grateful for the multiple funding sources. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually relatively difficult to work with individual farmers. That's one of the things we found out. Some of them are very high maintenance, do a lot of correspondence. So we're trying to focus a little bit more on the larger companies. So, for example, if you can get, say, Cargill or General Mills to support that. We're also working with Walmart directly. We're asking Walmart, why don't you sponsor, 50,000 acres of the use of Adapten? So that's the kind of the way we try to do this. People need to get used to the idea that they have to pay for these services. If you do a soil nitrate test and you send it to a lab, you have to pay for that as well. These cloud computational tools, it costs money to develop them and to maintain them. So, but the cost is relatively low. It's depending on the size. It's generally in sort of the $1.50, $2 per acre if it's a little bit larger operation. So it's really, and we have proved a profit of about 35. But yeah, if we can get more sponsoring, then that would be good. And one of the funny things about nitrogen fertilizations, it's very political and very state-based. So if you come up with a tool that kind of transcends all these individual, because every state has their own recommendation system. It's really kind of bizarre when you think about it. It's a leftover from many years ago. And when you come in with a tool that says, the state boundaries don't matter anymore because we account for variations in soil and climate and all that, you meet some resistance. It's very interesting, especially in the scientific community. Yeah. So with that, I won't talk more about that because I can talk for hours.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.